happy to see him. He had been a contributor, not a heavy contributor, to our campaign in 1960, so I wanted to express my appreciation when he invited us to come to his famous place in London, outside in the outskirts of London, this huge mansion and so forth. Mrs. Nixon, Tricia, and Julie and I welcomed the opportunity. And I remember he was very gracious. He had a very, very deep voice. He used to sit and say very, very little. He was kind and well-mannered and the rest. But when we went into lunch, one thing impressed me enormously. It was a magnificent room. We were served on gold plates, gold silverware. It wasn't just gold covered, solid gold silverware, and gold goblets. A gourmet French chef prepared beautiful delicacies. There were vintage wines. So I looked up at the head of the table, and here sat J. Paul Getty, the richest man in the world. You know what he had? Graham crackers and milk. And so I realized that there are other things than being rich. We were fortunate to have our health despite those defeats.
I think we've come to the end of an hour. We'll take a short break. Have some graham crackers and milk.
Yeah.
We'll take a 10-minute break here, and everybody back in position in 10.
And that's where it ended. Campaign didn't change
Didn't change that
thing.
much, yeah. Or
But on the other hand, who is to say, for example, what could happen when you stop to think of the media, you stop to think of the Catholic vote, you stop to think of the recession.
what you were going against.
It was tough.
And just a cyclical.
Yeah, could we get as far as we did?
Did President Kennedy's death make you reassess your own political situation in terms of running in 1964?
Oh, yes, it did. And in part it did because many of my friends talked to me thereafter and said, well, now it's very important for you to consider running again. I considered it, but only briefly, because when I analyzed the situation, I could see that Barry Goldwater was way out in front. He had done a superb job, and his supporters had done a very good job of mobilizing the party faithful across the country. It seemed to me that it was his turn, and that he was going to get it.
Who else was in the field then?
Well, of course, Governor Rockefeller, Nelson Rockefeller, was still in the fields, and the possibility, remote possibility, that George Romney might get in. Of course, Bill Scranton made an abortive push right at the last, but any realist would know there was no way anybody was going to get that nomination but Barry Goldwater. I knew it. What I felt was important, and President Eisenhower felt the same thing, that he not get it without having some kind of a contest. We felt we should have interest in the campaign and also enough of a contest so that some of Barry's rougher edges might be tempered a bit before he got into the final campaign. We didn't do a very good job accomplishing that, however. He rolled over the opposition so easily at San Francisco that he just got more the way he was. Let Goldwater be Goldwater.
You wrote in your memoirs that you were almost physically sick as you sat on the platform, having introduced him to the convention in San Francisco in 1964 and listened to his acceptance speech. Why was that, and why did you then campaign up and down the country for him right through November?
Well, you have to know the background. I introduced him. That was the role I had at the convention. It was only a 20-minute speech, and I would rate it probably the best political speech I ever made. Every line had been written out, carefully crafted. I remember the peroration very, very well. I said to the audience out there, because I knew that Goldwater had gotten a very, very bad press, I said, you've heard about this man, you've heard he's an extremist, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Listen to him. Judge for yourselves. And then I said, now I present to you the man who by his work in the vineyards over the years has earned the title of Mr. Conservative, who by the action of this convention is now Mr. Republican, and who with your support will become Mr. President, Barry Goldwater. The place came apart. Goldwater came in and got a huge, huge ovation. And we sat down and waited to hear this man that I had urged the nation, as well as the delegates, to listen to. He started by reading out of the party those that didn't support him, after I, in my speech, had tried to bring Romney people and Scranton people and Rockefeller people in behind our new candidate. He said, those that were not for us, we don't want you. And then he made a very famous statement. He said, extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. Now, you take those two sentences and read them, they're okay. But not from Barry Goldwater, because they were nailing him with the idea of being an extremist, of being a little kooky on foreign policy and domestic policy as well. Now, he wasn't a kook, but on the other hand, every time he opened his mouth, he proved their point. And so I sat there and listened to that, and I knew it was down the tube. I thought there was very little chance before that, but he had split the party. He was appealing to his own constituency only, and he had given Johnson and the Democrats the opportunity to tag him with the extremist label.
Didn't you know what he was going to say?
Oh my, no, I didn't see the speech.
Weren't you part of the, didn't they show it around to leaders of the party? And
They didn't show it to me. If they had, it would never have been in that speech.
in the wake of the Goldwater debacle, how did you assess your political chances in terms of coming back and running in 1968?
Well, I should first point out why I campaigned for Goldwater after that. President Eisenhower, with whom I was in very close contact, and I met with Goldwater and other Republicans at Hershey, Pennsylvania. We were attempting to get him to moderate some of his positions, not to become a mushy moderate, which is the worst thing. Far better to be a liberal or a conservative than to be a mushy moderate, stand for nothing. We didn't want him to do that, but we wanted him at least to be responsible. And so we had a long talk with him. Eisenhower particularly really read the act and said, Barry, you've got to quit saying these cockeyed things and words to that effect and so forth. And Barry said, well, that's the way I am, but I'll try to. So we all went out and had a joint press conference, and Barry made it worse than ever. They asked some question about what he would do insofar as the use of nuclear weapons was concerned in Europe. He said, well, I think we ought to give the responsibility and the power to launch those weapons to our commanders in the field. Well, Eisenhower just practically cringed because he knew that was first politically inadvisable and also militarily the wrong decision. You can't leave that decision, one that will bring nuclear war, in the hands of a field commander in Europe, no matter how good he is. Afterwards, I rode from Hershey back to Gettysburg with Eisenhower in the car. He gritted his teeth. That's what he usually did. He just gritted his teeth and his forehead would get all flushed up. He said, you know, before Barry met with us today, I thought he was just stubborn. Now I think he's just plain damn dumb. And which again was only his immediate reaction. Goldwater wasn't dumb. It's just the way he is. He's irrepressible. He says anything that comes to the top of his head, and consequently it was not easy. Now, as a matter of fact, in campaigning for him, I did it for a number of reasons. One, I knew the party was in trouble. I knew we were going to lose. But defeat is not fatal unless you don't fight. It was very important to fight. Rockefeller wouldn't help. Scranton couldn't do very much. Most of the other moderates stood it out, so-called. I was the only one around that could help, and the candidates around the country, people in the Senate and the House, were begging me to come in. I'll never forget, though, pretty tough to come in. I'd go in to campaign in this state or the other and candidate in advance and get the word to me. They'd say, please, please, when you endorse Goldwater, could you put it at another part of the speech? Don't put him with me. So the way I did it, I worked it out that at the very beginning I would endorse all the local candidates and the candidate for the House and the Senate. And then in the peroration, I'd go all out for Goldwater. That seemed to cut it all right. In any event, I drew huge crowds in that campaign. Actually made more speeches for Goldwater than he made for himself. But I have no regrets about it. It was the right thing to do. The party was still alive, although weakened as a result of the campaign. And from a personal standpoint, and I didn't do it for that reason, but from a personal standpoint, it proved to be indispensable to my winning in 1968, because that hard core of Goldwater people, with Rockefeller deserting them and others not supporting them, they felt a debt to me. So when we came to 68, I had the support not only of Goldwater personally, but of those workers out there, because they felt I had stood by them when others had not. In other words, the old saw, this is the time for good men to come to their aid of their parties. That was the time to do it. When the party is down, easy to support the party when it's on the way up or going to win.
You say that 1964 convention speech was, as you look back on it, your best political speech. Do you have a memory of one that you consider to be your worst or least best political speech?
No, there would be too many candidates there for me to select them out. I've never made a speech that I consider to be basically perfect. I've never I've never made a speech that I felt could not have been improved upon. I felt, for example, that my 1960 acceptance speech was better than my 1968 or 72 acceptance speeches, although each was quite effective. But on the other hand, in 1960, if I had to do over again, I would have perhaps cut 3 or 4 minutes out of it, out of the early part, so that I could have greater impact at the end. But who knows?
Do you have, or maybe it's a busman's holiday for you to go to speeches like this, but do you remember a speech that you heard that you considered to be the best, that you found moving or inspiring or persuasive?
Oh, there's no question about the first candidate there. That's MacArthur. MacArthur's famous speech, "No old soldiers never die," when he came back from Korea, was the most moving speech I've ever heard. He was a master.
In the wake of the debacle, the Goldwater debacle in 1964, did you reassess your own position in terms of running in 1968 for president?
Yes, I did. I first, incidentally, read Nelson Rockefeller out of the party. It wasn't personal, but what really got me down, after Goldwater lost, Rockefeller proceeded to kick him, and he tried to read Goldwater out of the party. And so...
How did he do that?
Well, he just had a press conference and said that this election had been a rejection of Barry Goldwater and everything he stood for and so forth and so on. Well, now you don't do that, particularly not then. Let the election speak for itself. So I had a little press conference, and I said that Rockefeller had not supported the candidate. He was therefore the last one that should speak out now, the last one the party would turn to him. I said the party was not going to turn for new leadership to those that had not supported the candidate in 1964. I also used a rather colorful phrase. I said he's had his pound of flesh. Let him subside. And so that handled that problem. Then in 1965, I guess it was my birthday, 1965, I began to reassess my situation. I have a sort of an old quaint old custom on birthdays. I used to always sit down and make a list of things that I might like to do in the next year. And so I listed various things I would hope to do in the year 1965. And as I did so, the thought occurred to me then that everything that I should do or would do between 1965 and 1968 had to be done in the context of the possibility of running again. I didn't decide to run then, but I opened my mind for the first time to the possibility thereof. Because after 1962, for example, the defeat for governor of California, the idea never occurred to me to run again. I thought I was dead, and I still thought I was dead after 1964. But after the Goldwater defeat, after Rockefeller had sat it out, I realized there was the possibility that I might be the one that could bring the party together and possibly win. But I didn't cross that bridge then. I just felt, however, that everything that I would do then had to fit into that particular pattern.
What was Rockefeller like? One gets the sense that he didn't sit around just crumbling up graham crackers into milk with all his money and power and ambition.
Rockefeller was a very attractive individual, attractive in the sense that he not only was rich, but he very gregarious. He usually come up, hiya fella, that's the Rockefeller trademark and so forth. It turned some people off, didn't turn me off. But you could have a good talk with him. He could be very candid at times. And at other times, he could be perhaps a bit on the devious side. He was a good politician, no question about that. I remember very well how blunt he could be. He lived, of course, in the same building that we did. And in 1967, after the 1966 elections, I remember that he talked to me about the possibility of his running in 1968. He made a very interesting point. He was very direct. He said, look, he said, in 1968 it's got to be certainly somebody other than Goldwater. He said, you know, Goldwater isn't too smart. He only went to college for 2 years. I was almost tempted to ask him how many years did Lincoln go to college. It was a little bit arrogant and so forth on his part. But
was he a snob?
Subconsciously, yes. He did not consciously. But when you're that rich and have had everything on a silver platter all your life, it's very difficult not to show just a little bit of that arrogance. It's the subconscious, or even I should say unconscious, arrogance of unlimited wealth. And he said, well, Scranton is waiting for a draft, and there's no draft around with his name on it. He says, only you or I can do it. And he said, you aren't going to run or shouldn't run because you're too smart to do that right at the present time. I said, I will run, and then if I can't make it, I'll support you. Well, we didn't make any deal.
You say that Rockefeller was a good politician and therefore partly devious. You are a past master politician. How devious are you?
Well, when necessary, one has to be devious. President Eisenhower, I think, is the best example of that. He was devious himself. He used others to do things that he did not want to do himself, and he respected that quality in others as well.
What is your definition of devious?
It means not doing directly something that may lose you support when you can find some other way to do it indirectly that will accomplish the end.
As you looked at the political landscape from 64 to 68, what use did you consider making, or what use did you see to be made of the 1966 congressional elections?
Well, the 1966 congressional elections were vitally important in 1968 for a fundamental reason. In 1960, when I ran, I knew that one of the reasons that I lost was that the Republican Party was so weak. After the 1958 elections, we only had 14 Republican governors out of the 50. We only had 34 Republican senators. We had only 155 members of the House. I had to run 5% ahead of the ticket in 1960 if I were to win. I did run 5% ahead, but I still lost by that minimal amount. So I realized that in 1968, we had to close that gap some, because after 1964, the party was down to the same level it was in 1958. So we had to increase the number of governors. We had to increase the number of senators, increase the number of congressmen It wouldn't be equal to what the Democrats have, but the Republican candidate for president wouldn't have to run 5% ahead, maybe 2 to 3% ahead. And that's exactly what we accomplished in that 1966 campaign. In that campaign, I was pretty perceptive. I must say I didn't have any polls to base this on. I just sensed as I campaigned around the country. But a month before the election, I made the flat prediction that we were going to have a great victory. Somebody said, well, could you give us the numbers? I said, sure. I said, we're going to win 40 new members of the House. We're going to elect 3 new members of the Senate. We're going to elect 6 new governors and 700 state legislators. Everybody thought I was crazy. It wasn't possible. Well, as a matter of fact, after the election was held and we got the returns that night, it was even a little better than I had expected. We'd actually won 47 new House seats, 3 senators, 8 governors, and a great number in the state legislature. So that gave the party the new life. It created a new plateau, a higher plateau for the presidential campaign candidate to pole vault from in order to win in 1968.
Towards the end of that campaign, President Johnson in a press conference dropped what turned out to be a bombshell, and it turned out that he dropped it directly on you. We have a film of that.
Yeah, I do not want to get in a debate on a foreign policy meeting in Manila with a chronic campaigner like Mr. Nixon. It's his problem to find fault with his country and with his government during a period of October every 2 years. And if you look back over his record, you'll find that true. He never did really recognize and realize what was going on when he had an official position in the government. You remember what President Eisenhower said, that if you'd give him a week or so, he'd figure out what he was doing.
How did it feel like to be called a chronic campaigner?
Well, first I must say that President Eisenhower called me after that, and he said, you've got to answer this. He says, every time anybody raises that goddamned give me a week thing, it just raises my blood pressure. He was really teed off by it. As far as being called a chronic campaigner by Johnson, he could have called me a lot worse. He knows a lot worse words than that.
What did you do to capitalize on the positive results to get a running start on this pole vault that you describe as a result of the results of the 1966 elections?
Well, we should first understand why Johnson said this. He doesn't use such rhetoric unless something had been effective. And what had happened there is that he came back from Manila, and there was a communique about the Vietnam War, which in a public statement I just tore to shreds. Bill Safire was very helpful in preparing that statement, incidentally. It was reprinted in full in the New York Times and across the country, and that just sent him right up the cotton-picking wall. That's why he responded as he did. But after that, I got national television time and made what I consider to be one of my top 2 or 3 best television addresses, again, totally without notes, in which I said in effect to President Johnson, I said, if you're listening, he said, I want you to know that I know how tired a man can be when he's done all this work in the office. I know, I realize that you're one of the hardest working men that has ever served as president. And when that happens, that maybe you say things that you might not really you shouldn't say, you wouldn't have said if you weren't tired and so forth. Well, of course, I figured that'd drive him up the wall a little bit more. I understand that it did. But the broadcast was very effective and may have helped get the margin up to what we had hoped, the great gains of the victory of 1966.
How did you use the combination of the publicity from this broadcast and the results of the 66 elections to sort of give you a running start for that pole vault towards 68?
Well, I did something very unique and very unexpected. Everybody after the 66 elections assumed that now the race for the roses begins, or the brass ring, or whatever you want to call it. I remember that the news magazines had on their covers the winners of 1966. And there, of course, were Romney and Scranton, et cetera, others who had won, the new faces particularly. And then I remember one commentator in particular, and I think other columnists may have made the same point, said that the big loser in 1966, ironically, was Richard Nixon. He, after having labored for the candidates across the country, probably more responsible than anybody else for the great victory, has in effect weakened his own chances because there are so many new faces on the scene. So I read that. Incidentally, I didn't consider that to be unfair reporting because I think it was quite accurate that that was the case, because Romney, unless he'd have won as he did in 1966, he would not have been a national figure. And so under the circumstances, I had to determine what was I going to do. Now, my friends all urged me when we all sat down at El Morocco that night in 1966 after midnight celebrating the great victory. We had spaghetti, incidentally, and red wine. And
why do you remember that?
Because I didn't go to El Morocco very often. I think that was the only time I went there while I was living in New York.
Why did you have spaghetti at El Morocco?
Because late at night, it didn't seem to me that anything more exotic would go down. And I like spaghetti.
Two good reasons.
That's right. And I think it goes well with red wine. In any event, my friends then, now you got to get in. You got to announce for president and so forth and get the ribbon clerks out. I said, no, I'm going to think about it. And the way that I made the decision is very interesting, a decision that shocked all of my supporters and also my opponents as well. I had to go on Meet the Press or Face the Nation, one of those talk shows. And as usual, I was preparing the Q's and A's that I thought might come up during the program. And I knew the inevitable question is, well, now, Mr. Nixon, what are you going to do? Are you going to run for president or what have you? And I tried to think, how in the world can I answer it? And then the thought struck me. This is one of the advantages of preparing things yourself, because it forces you to think a problem through. And the best strategy comes from getting the mind engaged and dealing with the problem. And the thought came to me, I'm going to answer that question. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to take a holiday from politics, a holiday for 6 months. Well, I announced it on the program to the consternation of everybody, because it didn't inform anybody in advance. And some of my friends thought, all is lost. The guy's out of his mind and so forth. But I knew exactly what I was doing. I did it for several reasons. One, Tom Dewey, years before, had given me very good advice. He said, there are times when a person in public life should get out of the public view. People get tired of hearing their politicians over and over again. Now, I know this isn't something that will be accepted by the pipsqueaks that advise most of our political leaders today. They think unless their man's on the evening news and the morning news and the radio or what have you, at 24 hours a day, that he isn't dominating the dialogue. They don't realize that people sometimes would prefer not to have the man on, to go away and then come back in, back and forth. To engage in the great rhythm of politics is very, very important to know. So first, I knew that it was well for me to get off stage for a while. Second, I was tired of campaigning, of making speeches and so forth. Third, I thought people might be tired of me because I've been out there so long. And then another reason was I wanted the opportunity to think things through. By that, I meant that if I had the chance to travel abroad, and I announced at that time, shortly thereafter, that I was going to make trips around the world to the 4 big areas of the world, a trip to Asia, a trip to Latin America, a trip to Africa, a trip to Western Europe. I found that after 6 months of traveling, I would refurbish my foreign policy image, call it what you like, but particularly what I knew about foreign policy. I knew that if I were going to run in 1968, I wanted to be the best prepared candidate in history in what I thought was going to be the major issue, the issue of foreign policy. So all of these reasons certainly motivated me in making that decision. And another reason was that I felt that it was probably from a political standpoint advisable to let the new men in town to get out to show what they could do, to see whether they, after hitting in the minor leagues, they could play in the big leagues. And very few could, just as George Romney discovered. He was a fine governor and an excellent candidate at the Michigan level, but he turned out to be a flop at the national level. So these were the reasons that motivated me, and as it turned out, it was one of the best decisions I ever made.
Some analysts say that you did it for precisely the reason of sort of flushing out the potential opposition before they were ready, in the same way that some analysts have applied the same analysis to what Senator Kennedy did recently by taking himself out of the race and thereby forcing everybody else in prematurely, at least by what they conventionally would have expected to be their timetable. Did you have that in mind then, and do you think Senator Kennedy may have had that in mind now?
No, my primary reason was not that. My primary reason were the ones I mentioned. First, the idea that I was tired of campaigning. I thought the people were tired of me. I thought I should get out of the public scene for a while. And second, I wanted to travel abroad. I wanted to find out more and more about how the world worked so that I would be thoroughly prepared in the foreign policy issue. I think all of these were the circumstances that motivated me. The other one was a secondary motivation, which turned out to be very effective. As far as Senator Kennedy is concerned, if he had asked for my advice as to what he should do, I would have told him to do exactly what he's done if he wants us to be president.
Are you saying that he doesn't ask for your advice?
Not lately, but in any event, in this particular instance, the best policy for him is to allow his potential opponents to get out there, cut each other up, and then to have the party come to him. He has been seeking it for some time, and he has some liabilities. He's completely aware of that. But if the party has to come to him, that would have a much greater effect. That probably isn't going to happen, although it could happen, but only if it appears from polls that are taken about 6 months from now, or I would say just before the Democratic Convention, that he and only he could beat Reagan. If the polls show that, watch out. He'll be the candidate.
Was this a real holiday from politics in terms of everything that was being done to further or develop your candidacy?
By no means. As a matter of fact, prior to taking off on my trips, I got together with some of my closest friends and political associates, people like Bob Hill and John Lodge and others in the Waldorf Hotel in New York. We had an all-day session. I said, look, I'm not going to play any games with my closest friends here. I think it's time to start an organization for the presidency in 1968. I want you to do everything you possibly can to develop the funds, to raise the funds, to develop the organization, to get the commitments that you can, so that when I do make a decision, that the game play will be there, ready to go into force. And so consequently, that's when it all began. The amazing thing, incidentally, in retrospect, I think the remarkable thing in retrospect that happened in that year, 1967 and 1968, that we were able to do it with so little. Rockefeller had unlimited money. He had hundreds of people, not just 10, not just 20, but hundreds of people, paid people on his staff, pollsters and speechwriters and political operators and local people and the rest. We had 4. We had Rosemary Woods and Pat Buchanan and Ray Price and Dwight Chapin, and Bob Ellsworth part-time. That was it in the year 1967. We had no money. Al Cole of Reader's Digest went out and raised money enough to finance some of my foreign travels. I financed a lot of it from my writing and legal activities and so forth and so on. But with very little money and very small staff throughout that year, we were able to stay even with the Rockefeller forces and so forth. We did through volunteers. Let me say this. It's very important for candidates to realize that a big staff is not always an asset. The bigger the staff, the less the candidate does his own thinking. The smaller the staff, the more dedicated first they will be, but even more important, the more the candidate is going to have to sit in his fanny and do the hard work to think the problem through. And that's what it forced me to do. So that by the time 1968 came around, I was ready. I was ready not simply because I could have a staff to give me this paper or that paper, or to put something on a teleprompter for me to read. I was ready because I had it all up here in my head. And so being poor, quote, unquote, at that particular time politically, turned out to be an asset, in my view.
Wasn't it at this time that your mother died?
She died in September of 1967. That was right after I finished the fourth of my trips. In fact, the trip was to Africa. The African trip was the last one. And I remember very vividly how I got the news. I was in the office actually working on some legal work, and I had a call from Rosemary Woods, buzzed me. She said, your brother Don's on the phone. I said, well, tell him I'll call him back. And because I've got some people in the office with me right here. And she said, no, you better take the call. I said, your mother just died. Well, it was not a surprise. She had had a stroke about a year or two before. But it's always a shock. And the worst part of it, of course, was telling Mrs. Nixon the phone and telling Tricia and Julie. So we got on the plane and we went out to the funeral. Funerals are always difficult, but of course, in this case, it was perhaps the most difficult one I've ever attended, because I was so close to my mother and my father as well. The funeral was held in the little church where I used to play the piano in Sunday school, and where we used to go, I remember, with my mother and father twice on Sunday, and even to prayer meetings sometimes on Wednesday. So it was a very closely knit group of friends and family. However, the church was simply thronged with people, and there were scores outside, because my mother was one who had no enemies, but had tremendous number of friends. She was a very, as I have remarked on occasion, a quite remarkable woman, as are most of our mothers. But she was very special. I know, for example, one thing that's rather amusing. My grandmother, her mother, lived 2 miles up the road from us on Whittier Boulevard. That's now Route 101. And my grandmother and my mother were alike in one respect. In the Depression years, in 1934 and 35, 36, 37, the tramps would come along. And they'd have, I understood later, a piece of ribbon hanging on a tree in front of those houses that were soft touches. My grandmother's house always had the ribbon, and no tramp ever stopped that didn't get a meal there. And no tramp ever stopped at my mother's place that didn't get a meal as well. But that was only part of it. I remembered particularly vivid memories of what she did when my brother Harold was sick. She went to Arizona with him. And in order to make ends meet, she took care of him, another boy by the name of Leslie, another one by the name of Larry, and another that we call the Major. He was a Canadian major that had been gassed in World War I, as a matter of fact. And all of them were there with tuberculosis. 3 of them were bed patients, not ambulatory. And she took care of all 4, cooked for them, gave them their alcohol rubs in the morning and at night, changed the bed linen, and did it by herself for 2 whole years. And then as each one of them died, she'd get the news it was if her own child had died. Harold died last. But in any event, we got there to the church, and there were no tears up to that point, because I'm not given to outward displays of emotion too often. But as I came through the line at the end, the ministers were at the door, and Billy Graham had flown out. He had liked my mother, and she had admired him. She had heard him and admired him when he was just starting, and he never forgot that. And when I saw Billy, all the emotion just came flowing out, and I started to cry. That's one of 3 times that I can remember ever crying in my adult years. The first time was after the fund crisis, when Bill Noland congratulated me for my speech. This was the second time. The third time was when President Eisenhower had died. But in any event, the emotion poured out. We followed the hearse out to Rose Hills, and she was buried there in the same plot next to my father and Harold and Arthur, my younger brother. And so we got in the airplane, and we start to go back, and I just thought back over the years. That's the kind of thing that runs through your mind, that we've done. And a lot of memories came back of my association with her, how close she was to me and to the rest of the family, and how much she'd meant to us. And I remembered particularly, and it sticks in my mind now, the last time I really ever had a conversation with her. This is before she had her final stroke. She'd had a terrible operation. She'd had gallstones all her life, and for a long time couldn't afford an operation, and then wouldn't get it, didn't want to pay for it, and so forth and so on. So finally she had the operation. And I remember visiting her there at the hospital, and she looked so tired and so dispirited, and her arms were so thin. I remember out of her nightgown, as I looked at her, she'd lost an awful lot of weight. And I could see that she was depressed, which was unusual for her because she never shared her problems with anybody else. And as I was getting ready to leave, I said, now, Mother, don't you give up. And all of a sudden, the spark came into her eyes. She raised up on her elbow, and she looked up at me, and she says, don't you give up. Don't you give up. Don't let anybody ever tell you you're through. And as I left, I wondered why she had said that. And I saw a copy of the Los Angeles Times out in the reception room. And there was a column in it where a columnist had said that President Nixon or Vice President Nixon is through. There is no way that he can ever recover from his defeats in California and for the presidency earlier. She apparently had seen that. But I was just thinking, very few people in politics have a legacy like that. Don't you give up. Don't let anybody ever tell you you're through.
You've talked about the emotional reticence in your family and your own. Did you ever tell your mother that you loved her?
No, we don't do that.
Did you ever,
No.
Looking back, do you ever wish you had
No.
been able to express it
No,
more?
And she didn't engage in that either. The affection, the love we have for each other was not expressed that way. Like, as I've often said, I think most people were, my mother always stated things in a very low-key way. Now, these days, if you're a good churchgoer and so forth, you're supposed to say, I'm praying for you. She never said that. If I was going to make a speech or going through a real difficult crisis, she would write me a note, or she would just say on the phone, I'll be thinking about you. Now, because she said that, some of the critics would say, well, why didn't she say, I'm praying for you? That was not her way. Love, I think, can be expressed in different ways. And I don't object to the way people today slobber over everybody else. I love you, like Johnson would and so forth. And many people in and out of public life. I understand that. But we're all a little different. In our family, we expressed our love through our deeds in a quiet way, rather than feeling that we had to burp it out every time it came into our minds.
What effect did your mother's death have on you?
Well, it was an emotional experience that was very substantial, but I think the major effect it may have had was the memory of that last conversation. Don't ever give up. I think that's what it was.
Do you remember if there was a moment, how and when, at what moment, you decided to run for president in 1968?
Oh, I remember it very well, because that's something you don't do that very often. Run for president, that is. Well, Harold Stassen does, but on the other hand, in this case, it was only the second time I had determined to run for president. And the way it happened was this. I had been thinking about it, of course, and the program was underway in late 1967. Money was being raised. People were being organized. I had been calling on governors and senators and congressmen and so forth and so on, never incidentally asking anybody to support me, however. I didn't do it that way. I don't believe in going into a governor or a congressman or a senator and say, look, will you support me? I always believe in presenting what I stood for, and then saying, if you feel that I can provide the best leadership to accomplish that particular goal, I would appreciate your support. But in any event, after having gone through all that, I decided to go to Florida and make a final decision to consider everything, because I didn't run for president lightly. I knew what an ordeal was to go through. And so under the circumstances, I didn't want to do it again, and I particularly didn't want to put my family through it again.
How did they react even to the possibility?
Well, under the circumstances, the reaction was quite different from what had been when I decided to run for governor in 1962. I remember we had dinner at our apartment, and Julie, with her typical fighting attitude, she said, you've got to run. You've got to do it for the country. And Tricia, approaching it in a slightly different way, she said, you have to do it because otherwise you'll have nothing to live for. And Mrs. Nixon, Pat, was put it a little different way. I knew that she wasn't very enthusiastic for it, but she said, just be sure that whatever you do, we love you and we'll support you. And so I took off from Florida.
Was Tricia right? If you hadn't run for president in 1968, would you have had nothing to live for?
At that time, yes. Yes, because basically my orientation was to engage in political activities. And there wasn't anything else I could engage in at that point that would really be enough of a challenge. You say run for House, run for the Senate, run for governor, or be a columnist or what have you. That wasn't enough. I think the only other thing I think many people would perhaps question as to whether there couldn't have been a challenge in another way. And I must say my good friend B.B. Rebozo, who was very successful financially, particularly as a banker, often said, just wish I would be more interested in what I'm doing financially to make some money. And I understand that for many people that's the beginning and end of it all, but it just doesn't interest me. I want enough to be comfortable, but to make a great fortune is something that I'm not interested in.
What do you have to live for now?
Well, that's something we can come to when we get to the end of the program.
Why did you go to Florida to make this decision?
Well, I wanted to be away from New York, away from telephone calls and so forth, be by myself. And my long experience in going to Florida with B.B. Rebozo and so forth he understood that. He was a very good friend. He's never one that wanted to sit down at the throne and have me confide in him as to what my decision was. I never discussed it with him, as a matter of fact. That's why he was such a good friend.
Even when you were there?
No. He's the kind of a man, very, very unusual. Most people that you know, that politicians know, and I understand this, they want to sit with the man and help him decide. But Beebe knew that I was somewhat of a loner, that if I wanted his opinion, I'd ask it. He never raised a question about it. If I had asked him, he would have given his opinion. But I knew before, without asking him, that he felt I should run. Particularly, he felt that way because he was pretty bitter about what happened in 1960. He wanted to reverse that situation. The other one that was down there was, however, and I didn't know he was going to be there before the trip was scheduled, was Billy Graham. He was recovering from a long bout of some pulmonary infection, had a terrible cough and that sort of thing. And we had a long, long walk on the beach. I remember about a 2 or 3 mile walk. He was so tired at the end that he had to sit down for a while and rest. And he was one who always gave me his best advice. And in this instance, he was very strongly of the opinion I should run. He had just come back from a trip around the world. He said, every place in the world the U.S. is in trouble. Every place in the world, it is essential that the U.S. provide better leadership than is being currently provided. He said, if you don't run and provide that leadership, I think the world is going to be in deep trouble. That had considerable impact on me.
We know the end of the story because we know you decided to run and won. Was there a moment at that time in Florida, that weekend, I guess, in Florida, that tipped the balance, or that you finally decided this is it and from now on I go direct?
I would say that the moment really was the Billy Graham moment, if there was any one. I don't mean that I was asking Billy Graham to be the judge on high to decide it, but when he talked about the people around the world, when he talked about his own huge constituency, not that he was going to deliver it, because he would never try to do that, the need for the leadership that I might provide, that made an impression on me. In other words, the idea that I would be running not just for personal purposes, that wasn't going to be enough, but for a cause. The important thing to bear in mind here is that for one to succeed in running for the presidency, he must, above all, want to be president to do something, not just to be somebody. I had already been somebody. I'd been vice president. Wasn't going to get anything more out of being president, in my opinion. But the important thing was to have a cause and to feel that you are best qualified to bring about the answers to that particular cause. That was really the thing that motivated me.
Why did you win the presidency in 1968?
Well, I won, I would say first, I think because I did have a cause. The cause being the need for new foreign policy leadership in the United States and in the world. Leadership that only the United States could provide in the world. Second, as far as that need was concerned, I, in 1968, I think I can say somewhat objectively now in retrospect, was the best qualified person. I didn't go out telling people that, but most people were aware of that. I had traveled broadly. I'd had a lot of experience as vice president under President Eisenhower, and there was no one else on the scene who had that kind of qualification. And third, I had a hard core of supporters. All of that helped me in terms of winning.
By the end, it was razor close. Did you think you were going to win as election night arrived, and in view of what they'd gone through in 1960, 1962, how did you prepare Mrs. Nixon and Tricia and Julie for election night?
Well, what had happened was that right after our nomination and after the nomination of Hubert Humphrey, the polls showed that we were going to win very, very handsomely or decisively. But I knew that wouldn't last. First of all, because Hubert Humphrey was a very good candidate. My, when you compare him with the likes of Mondale and Glenn and these other fellows that are running around looking for the Democratic, I mean, it's just too bad Hubert isn't alive today, because he can make the Eagles scream. But Hubert Humphrey was a good candidate. Second, there are a lot more Democrats than Republicans in the country. Third, I had the additional liability of George Wallace running on the third party ticket. Now, he was a Democrat, but on the other hand, all polls indicated he was drawing 2 votes, because I being a conservative and he being a conservative, 2 votes from me for every one that he was drawing from the Democratic candidate. And then fourth, of course, they still had the White House, And that White House almost finished us off with a bombing halt, which was called just 3 or 4 days before the election. But be that as it may, I still felt we were going to win. But I must say, just before getting on the airplane, which was to take us from California back to New York, I got a shock because somebody came up to me at the airport and stuck a microphone on my face and, "What do you think of the latest Lou Harris poll, which had been taken that morning?" This is the election morning, and came out election morning, I should say. It was in the Los Angeles Times. It shows Hubert Humphrey winning 53 to 47. Well, that was a shift because no poll had ever shown Humphrey winning yet. The Gallup poll still showed me slightly ahead. That, incidentally, would mean Humphrey winning by a majority of 5 million votes. I said, well, I'm not going to comment on the polls. So I had that in the back of my mind. Well, I climb on the airplane, and it was a festive occasion. The staff had balloons around and placards, President Nixon. I said, my God, I hope they're right. So I decided that we ought to really have a little family conference. And so I got Mrs. Nixon and Trish and Julie together. And I said, look, I think we're going to make it. But more important, I think we can be assured it will not be a long evening like it was in 1960. I proved to be a very poor prophet in that respect. But I said, what we have to be prepared for is the possibility of an upset because, you know, they've been coming on hard, been outspending us in these last 2 weeks, the bombing halt and all that. I still feel we're going to make it. And incidentally, I was confident to the last. I felt even then that though it was going to be close, because even though the polls had narrowed, as I looked at the critical states, I didn't think there was a way Humphrey could win an electoral college vote. I was particularly interested then in being very sure I didn't win the electoral college vote and he got a majority, or at least I should say a plurality of the popular vote.